Hello, everyone. It's about 2 minutes until the start time. Just as a reminder, we most likely will be starting 2 minutes after the start time. So it'll be 1:02 p.m. Eastern. But just as a reminder as well, is that you have a questions box that is available to you. If at any point in time you do have any questions, please feel free to post those questions in the that box, and we will do our best to answer those questions as we go throughout the session. Also, as a reminder, we have that website, dmarc.globalcyberalliance.org. There's an image there on the top right-hand side, which will be a link to the DMARC Bootcamp resources page. That's where all the recordings, resources, slide decks, and whatnot will be posted. So today's slide deck is already up there, so feel free to go ahead and download it at your convenience. So again, we'll start in about 3 minutes. Thank you. All right, everyone, welcome to week 3 of the DMARC Bootcamp. Again, my name is Shahzad Mirza, and I'm the Director of Operations for Global Cyber Alliance. So the last few weeks, for week 1, we gave the overview. Week 2, we talked about SPF and DKIM. So now we're going to go into detail with the DMARC policy itself. And that's what the plan is for this week. So the first half of this session, we're going to focus on the DMARC policy. We'll break apart each of the tags that are involved with the policy. And then the last half of this session, we're going to demonstrate to you how to implement SPF, DKIM, and DMARC using Windows DNS. So that is the plan for today. So let's go ahead and get started. In terms of the slide deck, people are asking about it, just really quickly again. So you go to dmarc.globalcyberalliance.org. When you go to that page, on the right-hand side, there's an image for the DMARC Bootcamp. Just click on that, scroll down, and you should see the links to the slide deck for this session. So let's start off just as a reminder about what DMARC is, because remember with DMARC, there's 2 parts to DMARC, right? There's the DMARC policy and there's DMARC verification, right? The DMARC policy is what you're setting up as a sending organization, right? The owner of the domain, to let people know that this domain is being protected, that these messages are being protected by these authentication mechanism, There's a conformance aspect to it, so make sure you follow our conformance standard as a sending organization as to what should happen to those particular messages. Right, and then the receiving side has DMARC verification, right? That's something they have to turn on. You have to enable that. So being you as the organization is sending and receiving, you have to do both, right? So the verification is something you're going to turn on your email security gateways, maybe even your email security providers that you have, and so on. Some of them do it and provide it to you by default. Some of them you do have to go in and turn it on and enable it, especially those hardware devices that you have, like Iron Ports and Mimecast. You do need to go in and implement it, or sorry, go in and turn it on in order for DMARC verification to happen. And again, remember, DMARC verification is checking all incoming messages to see if those messages have a DMARC policy applied to them or not. Now, our focus is going to be strictly on the DMARC policy, right, and the tags associated with the DMARC policy. And the reason is because when you create a DMARC policy, it's the same for everybody, right? It's not different for anybody. The difference may be how you put it into place, but all the tags and whatnot is always going to be the same for everyone. Whereas verification, where you get to it, where you go to it, the check marks, the different options that are available depending on the device or the gateway provider is going to vary. So you're going to need to follow the instructions or follow the guides that they provide you for verification aspect of it. So our focus here today is just DMARC policy, because that's something you have to create. And remember, where you have to create it, you have to create it on your DNS, your public-facing DNS. So things that you may need for implementation, know what systems you have in place, right? Because that's something you need to have in order to be able to create SPF and DKIM records. You need to know if those are set up correctly, right? So if you have the SPF and DKIM records, if you have those available to you, put them in, submit those. Have some level of access to DNS. So if you're not the admin to DNS for your organization, then find out who is, and then speak with them and tell them, like, look, I have records that I need to create. Are you the right person that I need to provide them to? Is there a ticketing or a change control process that it has to go through in order to implement this? So that way you know what the time variation is, right? Because some people have changed, like a 2-week change control period, or maybe a couple of days, depending on the organization. Really, in terms of list of subdomains, really what that should be is you should have a list of all your public-facing domains, right? And determine if those public-facing domains are being used for email or not, right? Because it's going to depend on which ones you're going to apply the DMARC policy on, right? Because if you have a multiple top-level public-facing domains, you want to implement DMARC on all of them, right? You don't want to just leave one out. You want to do DMARC on all of them. Okay, so that's something you need to take account. So, but if you have a top level domain with multiple subdomains that are public facing, you need to know which ones are used for email and which ones are not, right? Because all the subdomains you have to take into account. If they're used for email, what's the impact by implementing the DMARC policy at that top level, right? Do you need to create a DMARC policy at each of the subdomain levels? So those are things that you need to take into account and things you need for implementation. Now, also remember, if you from week one, what we showed you what the DNS TXT records look like, right? And this is again the example here. So remember, in DNS, you're creating TXT, right? So it's a specific type of record that you're creating in TXT, and there's multiple types of records. So for DMARC, it's TXT, and again later on, we'll show you how to actually create those records on Windows DNS. But there's a few things you have to take into account when you're creating this record. And the first and foremost thing is that for DMARC a record to exist, you have to have a name for that record, right? And that's something that happens in DNS. Some records require a name, some records just go based off your actual domain name. For DMARC, the name of the record has to start with _DMARC, right? So that underscore must be present, and then DMARC in lowercase after that. And then typically your DNS system will automatically append your domain name to it, right? So you don't have to add it, right? And those are things that we talk about. So like in Windows, you don't have to do that. In Linux or a bind, depends on where you place it in the bind file. Cloud service providers typically automatically append it as well. So at most you're only required the underscore DMARC and then automatically appends the domain after that. The value, right? There are multiple tags in the value. So as you can see here, so there's a basic is what you need at minimum in order to get through this. And then the complex just shows you some additional tags, which are optional and not necessarily required to have in order for DMARC to work. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through each one of these tags individually so that we have a better understanding of what they are, what they mean, and how you're actually going to use them. All right, so let's go through. So just take account a few things. If you notice that just one is that each tag is separated by a semicolon, right? So those semicolons are required when you go through this process for each tag. So here's just a slide that we put together just so people know which ones are required, recommended, and so on. So you have one slide that you can go directly to just to see what everything is and how everything is set up. So the very first tag that is required when you're creating the DMARC policy is V equals DMARC 1. That's defining the version that you're using for DMARC. There is no DMARC 2 or 3 or anything like that, right? There's no conversations or talks right now about V equals DMARC 2 or anything, there. You may have heard news about DMARC 2.0. That's not really V equals DMARC 2. It's just saying like DMARC and using BIMI or DMARC and using something else. So, but right now, when you create your policy, first and foremost, this has to be first. The V equals DMARC 1, semicolon, and then your next tag. All right. And that next tag after V equals DMARC 1 is the P tag. So your P tag is your policy tag. That will define the level of policy that you're implementing for your domain or for the domain you're applying this to. Right? And if you remember from week 1, you have the 3 options. So none, quarantine, or reject. And you just basically type it out just like you see on the screen. So V equals DMARC 1, semicolon, P equals none, semicolon. Or P equals quarantine, or P equals reject. Remember, only one DMARC policy per domain. Okay? Now, the other thing to take into account when it comes to the P tag, the P tag actually does not only apply to the domain you're defining the policy for, but the P tag actually also applies to all the subdomains for that domain, right? So if I'm creating a policy for globalcyberalliance.org and I just put in P equals quarantine, then that means all the subdomains for globalcyberalliance.org are also have a policy level of quarantine. Okay? So this is why it's important to know which subdomains you have and if any of those subdomains are being used for email, because the P tag then at that point has an impact on it, right? Because if you put your policy level at quarantine, then you're potentially blocking or putting those policies and those subdomain emails into someone's quarantine folder or spam folder. So this question here, can any DMARC policy allow an internal subdomain email, for example, at in.ibm.com to send email on behalf of the domain, i.e. at ibm.com? No, the DMARC policy is not going to do that. The DMARC policy is not going to allow a subdomain to send on behalf of a top-level domain. That's something you have to do with the email configuration and email settings. DMARC policy is not doing that. So that's a different email mechanism that you're using to do something like that. So again, yeah, so remember, so P tag applies to the top-level domain as well as the sub-level domains as well. So also remember what happens with each one of these messages, right? If you're at policy level none, right, you're in monitored only mode, right? So no enforcement to the DMARC in any way. So messages aren't being blocked because of DMARC, right? If they don't get through to the user, it's because of some other filter. It's not because of DMARC. Why are you at none? You're at none because you're going to be reviewing those reports to make sure that everything is functioning correctly, right? You're making sure SPF is set up right, DKIM is set up right, all the alignment is set up correctly, everything's passing, nothing is failing alignment, and so on, right? That's why you're starting at none. And then after you review your report, then you go to quarantine or reject, right? Because in quarantine, if those authentication checks fail, message is sent to the spam junk folder, At reject, the message is completely dropped if they fail all those checks. So remember, always start at none and gradually move your way to reject. Now, the other thing that you have to take into account is that just having this and stopping here is not going to help be useful to you, especially if you're at p equals none, right? Because if you're at v equals DMARC 1, semicolon, p equals none, semicolon, that's it. You're basically, yeah, you have a DMARC policy in there, but that DMARC policy is doing nothing for you. It's not doing a thing, right? Because DMARC, what did DMARC policy at none do? It's doing nothing. It's just saying there's a DMARC policy, but treat the messages like you normally do. Don't do anything to them. Don't do any level of enforcement to it in any way, right? And the way this is said also is you're not getting the reports, right? There's additional tags that you need in order to get reports. And I'm going to talk about those in the next slide. Now, the other thing you have to remember too, this is the exact order that you have to go in. So this order matters. V equals DMARC 1, semicolon, P equals, and then the policy level. So V has to come first, P tag has to come second, and then after that, you can put whatever tags that you wish to put in, right? And that's based off of the RFC for DMARC. And the other reasoning behind it is that certain systems that have DMARC verification, they look for the P tag as the second tag. They won't look for it in the other, and as a third or fourth or fifth tag. All right, so that's where you can come into issues, because I've seen people put the P tag as a third item or the fourth item. It can potentially cause issues where some DMARC verification systems will not recognize your policy. So always put the P tag second. The next two tags are RUA and RUF. These are the tags that you're going to put into place in order to enable reporting, right? So RUA is to enable aggregate reports, and RUF is to enable forensic or failure reports. Now, before I go into more detail with it, just to make sure it's clear here. So on this slide here, we're saying that the RUA tag is required and the RUF tag is recommended. So technically, the only required tags are V tag and the P tag. The RUA and RUF are not required. So meaning if you put in V equals DMARC 1, semicolon, P equals quarantine, semicolon, and stop there, you're still going to be using enforcement. Same with P equals reject. You're still going to be using enforcement. But when you're at none, it's useless without having the RUA and the RUF tags, right? Because again, those reports are going to help you get ready and tell you whether you can move up to quarantine or move up to the reject policy. So that way you're actually doing a level of enforcement. How do you implement it? So after the P tag, so P equals none, semicolon, or P equals quarantine, P equals reject, semicolon, RUA equals mail to, colon, and then the email address you want to have the reports sent to. Remember, the receiving side, right? The receiving servers are the ones who are going to send the reports back to you. RUF equals mail to, colon, and then the email address you want the reports to go to. Right, so the email address is going to be a domain within, an email address within your organization. So if you're setting up a DMARC policy for globalcyberalliance.org, the email address needs to be globalcyberalliance.org. So that's how it's set up by default. You can technically send to an external domain, so a different domain, but there's additional configurations that need to be done in order to be able to send to those domains. Unless you're Google. Google seems to send their reports to any domain. Doesn't matter who you put in there. They'll send the reports there. So the other thing to take into account is when you're creating these, your DMARC policy, use a generic account in your organization. Don't use your personal work email, because there's a good chance that you may get inundated with too many reports. So you can get too many emails. So it's best to use something like dmarc@company.com. Some organizations separate the two reports out. So they'll create an account called DMARC-RUA and an account called DMARC-RUF. They'll separate it out in that way, right? So there's options that you have, but just that's the thing that you want to do. Okay, you can add multiple email addresses as well. If you're going to add multiple email addresses, you separate those with a comma, not a semicolon, a comma. right? So in the DMARC policy, the tags are separated by a semicolon, but if there's additional, like in this case, RUA, you do a comma. So the last example there you see, it's RUA equals mail2 : DMARC -RUA at company.com, comma, mail2 : admin at company.com, semicolon, RUF equals, and so on. Okay, and same with RUF. So if you want to add multiple addresses, you just separate with a comma. But make sure that email address starts with mail2 : otherwise it's not going to work. That's a very important factor to this. So again, the differences between RUA and RUF, just very quickly, RUA is for aggregate reports, right? That's the summary report that you get with IPs and what's going on with SPF, DKIM, and if they're passing or failing DMARC. And RUF is going to be the actual message that it's going to be delivered to you that's failing for some reason with the DMARC checks. The other question, can a policy be done on specific users or only domain? DMARC policy applies domain wide. It's not user specific. It only applies to the domain. DMARC is a domain based policy. Right. Same with SPF and DKIM. SPF and DKIM are also domain-based policy. They're nothing that we're talking about is going to be user-based. All right. So we said V tag is required, P tag is required, RUA tag where GCA is saying it is required because again, it's pointless to have a policy without getting some level of reports. RUF is recommended. The next tags we're going to be talking about are optional. Now, the thing is by optional, that means that it's not required for you to explicitly define the tag. So if you do not explicitly define the tag, the default setting for that tag is what will be used. Okay, so I'll explain that as we go along. So the first tag is the FO tag. Okay, this is only used if you're using the RUF tag for the forensic failure reports, right? And what this is going to define what to trigger to send those message samples. So what in the message are you triggering based on? So your options are 0, 1, D, or S. Right, so in the example I put in at the top FO equals and in bracket 0, 1, I forgot the comma there, but it should be 0, 1, D, S. You pick one. I'm just displaying it as these are the options that you choose between. So 0 is the default. So if you do not put in the FO tag, the DMARC policy will act as if FO equals 0 was present. So what it'll do is it'll send the message samples if all underlying authentication mechanisms fail to produce an aligned pass result. So if SPF doesn't have a pass and DKIM doesn't have a pass, then that's where you'll get those message samples. Okay, generate report if any underlying next option is 1 is generate a report if any underlying mechanism produces something other than an aligned pass result. Right, so if it's because in some cases, some systems will they don't say fail, but they'll say fail unaligned or a different option. So that's why a lot of people end up using FO equals 1. So, if it doesn't see a pass or if there's any other option in there, that's what it'll generate back. D is only if there's an issue with DKIM, right? So DKIM is failed regardless of alignment. That's what's going to happen. S is for SPF specifically. Right, so typically 0 or 1 are the options that's used. Most people tend to stick with the default, and that's perfectly fine. But I have seen some cases people actually using 1, but not too many in terms of DNS. The next ones are ADKIM and ASPF. Again, both of these are also optional, so they're not required. If you do not use them, the default setting is what is called R, or which is relaxed. What ADKIM and ASPF are doing are checking for the alignment of DKIM and SPF. So how strict or relaxed are you going to be with the alignment? So by default, it's relaxed because what could happen is that if your from domain is globalcyberalliance.org, but if SPF or adkim happens to be a subdomain or the other way around, so if your from domain is a subdomain, but your SPF and DKIM is using the top level domain instead, it's saying, okay, it's relaxed, it's fine, we'll accept those. We'll allow that to pass, it's fine. And that's something you tend to stick with when, especially when it comes to third-party vendors, because they end up forcing you to stay at the relaxed alignment. Strict is we're basically saying the from and the domain and DKIM and what is SPF has to be the same. It has to be an exact match. So if the from is a subdomain and your DKIM signature shows a domain for top level, that's not considered aligned at that point. So you're saying that's no longer considered aligned, so it has to be, but it has to be the same, exact same thing. It's word for word, letter by letter, it has to be the same exact thing in both for alignment to be occurring. So strict, you should only use really if you have complete control over your servers and your DKIM signatures and keys. That's when you should use S. Or after you review the reports. So if you review the reports and you see all the third-party vendors that you're using are using and the alignment is passing and there's not any weirdness in the alignment, so I mean they're not using like a subdomain or some variation, then yeah, then at that point you can consider using strict. But it most commonly is R, and sticking with the R is there. Now, do you have to put both adkim and SPF in there at the same time? No, you don't. So you can put in adkim equals S and completely leave out ASPF. That's perfectly fine, right? Or you can put in ASPF equals S and leave out adkim. That's perfectly fine. You don't have to put both tags in there. Okay. But again, remember, if you do not explicitly define one, the default for that specific tag will be relaxed alignment. So is there a best method to align SPF or DKIM so that third parties can send messages on your behalf? That's where that's where it's a little bit tough, because it depends on the third-party vendor. Because some third-party vendors are good with both, so you can actually do both and you'll be fine. But then there's other third-party vendors where they'll set up DKIM properly, but they won't set up SPF correctly. In most cases, I've seen DKIM be the one that's always aligned with the domain, but the SPF is the one that tends to have issues. So that's where it's not easy, and that's why a lot of people end up saying with the default of the relaxed alignment when it comes to DMARC. The next two tags, RF and RI. So again, both of these are optional. So with RF is defining what's the format the report should be delivered in. I mean, they're going to be XML. I mean, that's the way it is. It's just for how the XML schema that's being used and the layout for it. So the default is AFRF, which is abuse report format. Your other option is IODEF, which is incident object description exchange format. So I'm not going to do a deep dive into that because there's just too much in that. I mean, we wouldn't be able to get to the demonstrations or anything like that. But I provide the RFCs here so that way you can look them up and take a look at each one. Really, the only decision factor in terms of using it depends on if you're using like a SIM device or a log collection type device or something like that, which may tell you that, okay, we need it to be in this format in order to be able to ingest it. That's the only typically the deciding factor. I personally have never seen IODF actually ever used. That again, but that doesn't mean that it's never been used. Good chance there's somebody out there I just haven't seen one yet. In terms of using IODF of the whatever number of domains I've looked at throughout this past 5 years or so. So I've actually never seen the RF tag actually really used. So, but just take that into account. Like when you're trying to ingest it, you may have to use the IODF depending on where you're trying to ingest this into. RI is the reporting interval. So how often or what interval, what time frame should the receiving side be sending you the reports? And when you're defining this, it's in seconds. Right, so again, if you do not define it, the default is 84,600 seconds, which is 24 hours. So it's about a 24-hour period that the receiving side will send you a report. So it may not be exactly 24 hours from the time you implement your policy, but within a 24-hour. But the report itself should have a 24-hour period of information within that, for the aggregate report especially. Right, so the only time I would recommend using the RI tag is if you need to get to quarantine or reject relatively quickly. So people will reduce that number, you know, maybe to an hourly basis so that they can get reports relatively quickly and be able to see, you know, as they're making changes to SPF and DKIM, they can see those changes quickly instead of having to wait about 24 hours for the next report to see what's going on. So they can just make the changes they need to make, do that, and get to reject, you know, a little bit quicker than having to wait for a longer period of time. But I mean, once you're at quarantine or reject, I would recommend just either remove the RI tag or just leave it at 24 hours at that point. Don't leave it at that hourly or whatever you change it to. But again, remember, this is in seconds. So don't put in RI equals 10, right? Because you'll get a report roughly every 10 seconds, and that's not going to be useful to you. You should probably stick to like a 30-minute or an hour interval so that we get enough information, can collect enough information within that hour, and have, you know, be able to do what you need to do. The PCT tag, which is the percentage tag, is also optional. If you do not use it, the default is 100. So the values can be anywhere between 0 and 100 that you would put in there. So you can put in PCT equals 0 or PCT equals 50, 25, whatever number that you want to put in, all the way up to 100. Now, what does this do? What it's basically defining is saying that this percentage of messages that are being sent from this domain should be impacted by this DMARC policy. So really, I just see it when people go to quarantine, or really when people go to quarantine or reject, that they tend to use the PCT equals. But the problem is that there's no way to define which messages. You won't know which messages are going to be impacted by the DMARC policies and which ones are not going to be impacted by the DMARC policy, right? So there's nothing to tell you like, okay, only do it from these servers or only do it from those servers. You can't define that in your DMARC policy, right? So this is actually one of the tags that is being questioned by the DMARC working group of whether it's still really effective or not. So there's still a kind of a debate about using it. I still haven't seen a good reasoning behind it, especially since you don't have control over it. But this option is available to you, and people have used it. Just be wary of the fact of those two bullets that you see there. If you use P equals quarantine semicolon PCT equals 0 semicolon, you're basically just had a value of P equals none. You basically just drop down your policy. Same thing if you put P equals reject semicolon PCT equals 0 semicolon, you basically drop yourself down to quarantine. Right. So just be wary of that fact when if you decide to use the PCT tag, especially when you set it to equal to 0. And remember, again, PCT equals 100 is the default, so you don't even have to put that in if you're going to do 100%. Then the last tag, and this one's also optional, but it is strongly recommended that you take it into consideration and actually consider using it. So the SP tag is your subdomain policy tag, right? Because remember, what did I say about the P tag, right? When you implement the P tag, that applies to your top level domain as well as all your sub level domains. But then, you know, when they thought about, the creators of DMARCs thought about this, said, well, wait a minute, what if they have subdomains that send email? That's going to cause a problem, right? So these are factors you take into account. So what are the different policy levels for the SP tag? It's the same as the P tag. So it could be SP equals none, or SP equals quarantine, or SP equals reject. So when should you consider using this? If you know for a fact you do not have any subdomains, and your top level domain is still at P equals none, and you're still reviewing reports to see and make sure SPF, DKIM, alignment, all those things are working, put in SP equals reject. Why? Because now at this point, you're preventing any spammers, phishers from using a subdomain version of your domain while you're still reviewing reports. Okay, and this happens to some locations, so like a city government, for example, we're going through the DMARC, starting with DMARC policy, they actually did see in one of the reports that, wait a minute, someone's using m.city.com. We don't have a domain for M or public domain for M, or let alone sending an email using m.city.com. So they asked, what are we supposed to do? We told them, add the SP tag in there. So I like confirm with them, are you absolutely positive that there's no subdomains that are being used for email purposes? They said no. So we said put in SP equals reject, and that will block it. But again, reminding them, just remember that it could potentially, if there are other emails coming from a subdomain, those are going to get blocked too. So they did it, they checked the reports, continuously reviewed it, and then they were at least able to block those messages immediately, at least for those who had DMARC verification enabled. But on the flip side is if you do have multiple subdomains that are being used for email purposes, right, and your top level domain is ready and you're ready to move up to an enforcement level, then put in SP equals none, right? Because in that way, at least you can move your top level domain to reject or quarantine, and then your subdomains do not have a policy. The top level domain policy is not being applied to the sublevel domain. Then what you would need to do is to go to each your subdomains and create a DMARC policy there, right? You'll create an SPF, you put in the DKIM records for that subdomain, and then create a DMARC policy for that subdomain. Your subdomain policy will override your top level domain policy, okay? Because in the email is going to have your subdomain. That's what's going to be looked up for the policy, not your top level domain. All right, so that's why you really need to consider it. It's an optional tag, but really take it into consideration. This is why we say during this implementation process, if you can get a list of your domains that are public facing, then that way it can help you out to determine what you need to do, where you need to create the policies and such. So those are all the tags. So those are all the different tags that are out there. Those are all the different tags that are available to you with the DMARC policy. All right, so I'm going to go through, there's 2 questions here. I'm going to go through those really quickly, or answer them, and then I'll go into the demonstration. So, okay, so there's a question about what's required to use the other domain, the RUF and RUA and RUF. If I have time during the demonstration, I'll show it to you. I'll try to show you what to do. If I don't get the chance to do that in the demo, please send me an email directly, and I will give you the instructions on what you need to do for that. And then the other question I already answered about the best method to align SPF and DKIM with third parties. All right, so let me go into the record creation and show you how to do that. So let me move to my Windows desktop. Oops. All right, so now hopefully you should be able to see the Windows system. So what basically I have here is, so Office 365 I have open up in my browser. So the Office 365 Admin Center. Then back here I have my Windows DNS Manager, right? So here's our domain.dmarc.org. This is the domain that we have that's public facing, right? So here's our www, here's a mail exchanger record that we have in here as well. Right, because remember, when we're creating this, we're going to be creating this on our public system. It has to be public facing, right? And creating it internally is not going to help, right? Because no one can, no one goes into your internal DNS. It's always your external DNS, your public facing DNS that these records need to be created on. So we're going to start off with SPF first. Now, if you remember from last week, the type of record we said that you need to create for SPF is a TXT record. So what I'm going to do here is in my DNS manager, I'm going to right click. So I'm making sure, you're in your 4 lookup zones. In this part here, I'm going to right click. Now, typically it lists most of the record types here, but since TXT is not listed, I'm going to choose other new record. And then from here, this just shows you the full list of all the types of DNS records you can create. We're creating specifically TXT. So I choose that, create record, and now I'm going to create my record. So there's a few ways that you can do this, right? So one is I can just start off, and if I remember everything that I need to do, I can go that route. There's our SPF wizards and creators that are online that you can use, and you can follow those instructions and put them in here as well. If you're using something like Office 365, they will actually tell you what to do as well. So if you're in your admin center, and in admin center, there's an option for settings and then domains. And this is where it will tell you, okay, these are your domains that are associated with your account. So dmarc.org and dmarc.onmicrosoft.com. Now remember, the email address you're actually using is got.dmarc.org, not got.onmicrosoft.com. So this is the one that you need to create the DNS records for. So in this case, it says it's healthy because technically we're actually using a different, we're using something else for DNS when it comes to the got.dmarc.org. But this is where it will also tell you, these are the records that you need to create. So it tells you need to create this MX record. So this MX record needs to be present in order for this to work. So let's just quickly do that. So I'm going to go in here. Let's cancel that and choose mail exchanger. So in here, actually I needed to create a, no, that's right. Put this in here, click on OK, and there's my MX Exchange record. But for SPF, again, TXT record, and here it tells you what the TXT record should be for your SPF. It actually gives it right to you. Now, the thing to remember, though, is that when you're doing this, please first make sure to check you don't already have an SPF record. Because if you already have an SPF record, what you're going to really do is you're just going to take the include:/spf.protection.outlook.com. You're just going to copy that part and add it to your SPF record, right? You're not going to create a new record, okay? You're not going to create a whole new record. You can only have one SPF per domain. So all we have to do in order to create this record is for SPF, we keep the name blank. It's not required. You do not need to put an @ symbol in there. You don't need to type in out null or anything like that. Leave it blank, right? Because it uses the parent domain if left blank. So it just uses got.dmarc.org, and that's how SPF is recognized. All we have to do is in the text section, paste in the information that is required. And then I click on OK. Done. And now I have my SPF record, right? So now if I need to add something else, so like say we have Salesforce and we're actually using Salesforce to send mail. I go to that record, right? So all I did was double click on it. I go to that record and I need to add to this whatever Salesforce says to include as for their systems. So it's _spf.salesforce.com. I just hit apply, and now that's my new SPF record, and I'm allowing Salesforce. Right, the other things we have to take into account, I actually am using MX records, so I actually have an Exchange server here. So I need to add in the tag MX. Oops. Right? Or I could put in a : and then the domain name of the system. So this is where I'm doing. So you see all the changes I'm making to that specific record. I'm not creating a whole new SPF record, right? Only one SPF record per domain. Now, typically when also with Office 365, in some cases, if you link it to your DNS, it'll automatically create the records for you. So just be wary of that. When you do that, it's not going to look at your existing SPF. It's just going to create another one. So you may have to go back and combine the two at that point. So we no longer need the IP address of the senders for mail in the network. So IPv4. So if you put MX in there in your SPF, you don't have to put in IPv4. Right, but I mean, you could still use IPv4 and not put in MX. It's up to you. The only reason I would put IPv4 over MX is if you're reaching that 10 domain lookup issue that SPF has to deal with, right? That issue that's there. If O365 MX is the only mail exchanger, then still do we need to use include? Yes, it is strongly recommended. Even Microsoft recommends it, that even if you use MX, still have the include That's just to safeguard you, right? Because here, when you're creating the DMARC exchange, you're using something specific, but by putting in aspf.protection.outlook.com, you're actually covering all the systems just in case if there's something happens. So it is recommended to still put in the include : aspf.protection.outlook.com. That's for any type of system. Even if you're using Google G Suite, still put in include ._aspf.google.com. So still do that. All right, so that's SPF. So next is DKIM. So now with DKIM, right? So if you remember from last week from DKIM, there's two types of DKIM records that you can create. You can either create a TXT record or you can create a CNAME record. I'm going to show you both. What does it depend on? It's dependent on what you're using, right? Most third-party systems will actually have you create CNAME records, okay? If you're using an on-prem type system, you're going to be using TXT records, okay? That's what we talked about last week. There are some third-party vendors, just take note, some third-party vendors do use TXT still. So make sure you follow the details and the instructions that are provided to you by that third-party vendor, all right? They'll tell you whether to use a TXT record or to use a CNAME record, right? So in terms of Office 365, it's using and creating CNAME records, all right? And the way you would do this here is there's nothing in the main admin center. What you actually have to do is you have to go down to the Exchange portion of your admin center. So you're going to the Exchange admin center, and in here, there's going to be an option for protection, and under protection, there's going to be an option for DKIM. So whenever it loads, so here's protection. So you see here, there's still a DKIM. As a side note, you see here, there's other filters, malware filters, spam filters, connection filters, outbound spam, and so on. You still need to use those, okay? Don't just rely on DMARC to do your filtering. Still go through the malware filter setup, go through the connection filters, the spam filter setup, go through all of those because those filters are still going to be used. Okay, so don't ignore setting these up or checking these just for things. But for DKIM, right, this is where it's going to define how you create your DKIM keys and set up DKIM authentication and DKIM signing, right? So by default, Office 365 has DKIM signing enabled, but it is not using your domain in the DKIM signing or the DKIM signature. The domain that it's using is the onmicrosoft.com domain, right? So if you're just using DKIM and DKIM verification, it'll be fine. But once you implement DMARC, right, what gets thrown off? Alignment, right? Because DMARC requires the alignment to be done, right? So in DKIM, if DKIM is saying that the domain is gotdmarc.onmicrosoft.com, but your from domain is gotdmarc.org, now you're misaligned, right? Alignment is off and DMARC is going to be considered fail unaligned. So what you actually need to do is when you go in like something like Office 365, you actually have to go to gotdmarc.org and you have to enable it here. Now, the thing is you can't just enable it. You actually have to create the records first. And then you come back here and enable it. Now, in this case, because I had a little setup enable, typically what happens is you click enable, a little box will appear here, and it'll tell you that you have to publish your records first. And I think when I created the records, I may not have set them up correctly, but it should tell you what the values of those records are going to be. So you end up creating as two CNAME records. So in this case, it's telling you create a CNAME record. Okay, so let's do that. So if I right click here, I have the option to choose new alias or CNAME, right? Because that's what a CNAME record is, right? A CNAME record is basically saying that my domain has I'm using DKIM keys or I'm using this, but when people go to this domain, redirect them to this other domain. So, so the actual key is actually going to exist at Microsoft. It's not the actual public key does not exist with you. So when it comes to Microsoft, when it comes to creating CNAMEs, they will always define what the CNAME record is going to be, right? So it's always selector 1 _domain key. And then the second one is called selector2._domain keys. That's always the case. You do not have a choice in that. Okay. And this is a problem like a lot of people do. That's why I keep saying you have to follow what the third party provider gives you for the name of the DKIM record that needs to be created. You cannot pick your own. Follow whatever they say. And they will typically also define for you what the actual domain that you need to point it to. So in this case, I mean, Office 365 tends to follow a strict format, which is basically selector1 dash the domain ._domain key then got DMARC on Microsoft.com. But you notice where this, I got DMARC on Microsoft.com. Well, where did I get that from? If you go back into my admin portal, you see you have got DMARC on Microsoft.com. That's the actual key that's going to be used. That's why don't disable this, because you're basically saying that at this pace, selector1._domain key.got DMARC.org, you're going to go look up to this domain to see what the record is, the actual public key is. So I click on OK, and there you go. Now I have my selector. So technically here, I'm going to actually have to create another one because there's actually two for Microsoft. So the second one I would create, right, it'd be just selector2. Whoops. So selector2._domain key. And click on OK. So once this is created and obviously spelled correctly, in this case it wasn't, then I would have to go back, click on enable, and then it'll actually do the lookup and see if those records actually exist. Now just be patient with it. It may not find it immediately. Typically I've seen cases where it finds it within about a 5-10 minute period, but there have been cases where it has been like 24 hours that it hasn't found that the record yet, because a lot of it's depending on your DNS replication and how quickly it's going to replicate. So be patient with that enable button, because you most likely did set it up correctly, but there's, it's just DNS hasn't replicated out. So when it did the lookup, it's just not finding it. So that's how it's for using Office 365. So, but here in this case, we have an Exchange server on-prem. Okay, so we have an Exchange server on-prem. So what do we do in that kind of situation? So what we have is a tool called DKIM Exchange. So we already downloaded it. It downloads as configuration.tkim signer. What DKIM Exchange is, it's a tool you can get off of GitHub. All right, it's not a Microsoft product. Just be aware of that. It's not a Microsoft product. It's a third-party developers created this and put this together because they needed to have some way of signing and using DKIM on their Exchange servers. All right, so DKIM Exchange is one that is quite widely used, and it is supported fairly well. So you get it downloaded from GitHub. And when you download it, you basically just, once you unzip it, you're going to run this file configuration.dkim signer. And what this will do is when it'll open up an application window, and you just basically it's going to look for your Exchange server. If you have an Exchange server present, it's going to tell you what's there and have everything set up and let you connect to it, let you configure it, click on install, just to make sure that it creates the signature, that the signing capabilities and so on, and links to your Exchange server. In our case, we don't have an Exchange server on here, but it does support, quite a large number of the latest Exchange systems. But what you would do here is you would go to set up the keys, you would go to domain settings. Oh, and I actually have one there. Forgot to delete it. Let me delete that, so I can show you what to do. So what you actually have to do is under domain settings, this is where you would set up your keys and create your keys, right? So you click on add, right? You're going to define the domain that you're creating this for. So got.dmarc.org, right? So you can't just pick any domain. It's got to be the domain for that server that's being used. So whatever email you're sending out, at whatever. The selector, now in this case, the selector can be whatever you want, right? So this is where you have that option of creating that selector name for your domain. Okay, so that's where your option that you have. So if I wanted to call this one, oops, I want to call this Exchange. one, because I'm associated with my Exchange server, I can do that. You know, or if I wanted, you know, some people tend to put the date, right? So 2020, what's the date? The 29th. So 0929. You know, so that way they know when to rotate the key, and you know what the the date the key was created, when they can rotate the key later on. That's totally up to you. Just do not pick the same name as the ones you already have. So I cannot use selector 1 or selector 2. Why? Because they're already in use, right? It has to be a unique name, right? Since I'm using Office 365, selector 1 and selector 2 are already in use, so I cannot use that again. I cannot use that in this instance. Here you can also define the key length. So you can use 1024 or 2048. So once you define those three settings, then you can click generate new key. It's going to ask you where do you want to save the file. I already have keys here, so I'm going to overwrite it. So I'm going to put it in the same location. Click save. So yes, I want to replace it. There's a public key. So yes, I want to replace it. And then here is going to give me all the information. It's going to tell me this is the suggested DNS name for the record, and here is the suggested DNS value. So what you're seeing here is vehicle DKIM1, it's using RSA, and this P equals, right, is your public key. Right, so now what I need to do is I need to go back into DNS. Well, actually, sorry, even before I go back into DNS, you need to make sure you save this, right? Save the domain, and then you're going to go into the other settings, like you can go into DKIM settings for other information, but then also here, this is where you're going to make sure everything is set up for DKIM signing. But then this is where now I can take this part of the suggested DNS name. So in this case, since I'm using a public key and the public key is being defined, I'm going to create a TXT record. So in DNS, I right click, choose other new record, scroll down, find TXT or text, create the record. So under record name, remember, all I need is the selector and the underscore domain key. I don't need to put in the whole thing, right? Because Windows automatically appends the .dmarc.org. Then under text, I need to take this whole information. So I'm just going to copy to clipboard, go in here, paste it, and now I have my entire DKIM record for that Exchange server. So done, and there's my new DKIM key. Okay. So this is what you would do even if you were in a hybrid environment, right? If you still have your own on-prem Exchange server and you have Office 365, this is exactly what you would do. You would still create the CNAME records. You would use a DKIM Exchange on that Exchange server and then put in your DKIM records at TXT. So where's the private key? The private key was where initially it told us. So if I select key file, so it's under C, program files, Exchange, DKIM, signer, keys. That's where it's located. But this is why you have to run this on your Exchange server, right? You're not going to run this on like your AD server or some other server. It has to be on the Exchange server. That's the only way it will link to it. Okay. So this is what, now the other thing is though, if you have like an Ironport or Mimecast, those systems do DKIM signing and DKIM key generation. Do it there. All right, do it on that system, right? So that way you don't have to do this on every single Exchange server in your environment, right? Because you're gonna have to do this for each Exchange server. But if you have a gateway that all your outbound mail is flowing through, and that gateway does DKIM signing and DKIM key generation, do it on that gateway. That would be better than having to doing it this way. All right. So that's your DKIM keys. So your CNAME records and TXT records. Now DMARC. So now how do I create a DMARC record? I'm using my own on-prem Exchange. I have Office 365. Well, that doesn't matter, right? Because when you're creating a DMARC policy, you're creating the policy for the domain. You don't need the IPs or domain name, the mail exchange domain names. Why? Because that's what your SPF and your DKIM records are for. What you're going to do here is in your DNS, all you're going to do is right click, choose other new records, scroll down, choose TXT, and you're going to start creating your DMARC record. Right? You're going to start creating your DMARC record at this point. So remember, we just talked about it, right? What do we call the name of our DMARC record? Underscore DMARC, right? In Windows, I don't need to add the domain because it automatically adds the domain for me. So just underscore DMARC. What do I do under text? This is where now I started putting in those different tags that we talked about. There are DMARC creators and wizards online that you can use to help guide you with this. If you choose to use them, feel free to do so. But remember, when you do those, just make sure that it's only underscore DMARC and you put in TXT. I realize we only have a minute left. So obviously I'm going to go over. I'm going to go to completion. I'm going to show you everything and then go back to answer the questions. So if you can stay longer, please do so. I apologize that we're going over, but I am going to cover everything. So in the TXT, this is where now, again, we're creating our DMARC policy, right? So we're going to start off. Remember, always start off with V equals DMARC1, semicolon. Okay, DMARC in caps. So V equals DMARC, semicolon. What's next? P equals, and then the policy level you're going to put in. So we are always going to start off with none, right? Those are required. Are we done? No. Next step here is put in RUA. Because remember what I said, just by putting this, you're not doing anything. You're not looking at anything. There's no information. There's no added information. You put in RUA equals mail to colon, and then where you get to send the reports to. DMARC.org. Right? And then semicolon, and then I'm going to do RUF as well. And semicolon at the end. And that's it. Now I have my DMARC record. Right there it is. So now this is what I'm going to modify if I need to modify it. So like one thing I realized, oh no, I'm seeing m.dmarc.org emails. So now I need to go back and adjust that, right? Because that's not supposed to be happening. So what I do now, I just go to the end of it. I'm going to put in sp equals reject because I don't have subdomain, so I want to protect my subdomains. Hit apply. Right? So any changes that I need to make, I just make in here. I reviewed all my policies. I reviewed all my reports. Everything's good. I'm going up to p equals reject. Just change it. Remove none and put in reject. That's all we have to do. So you're just changing that one modif. The only thing that you could probably be modifying the most is your SPF, and you're most likely be adding new DKIM records. All right, that's most likely most of the changes that are going to be happening. Right, all those other tags I mentioned, you can add them in as you choose to. That's totally dependent on how you want to do this. Right, so if I want to say, well, I want my DKIM key, my DKIM alignment to be strict, I can put in a DKIM equals S. Right? Remember, I don't have to put in a SPF. That by default will be relaxed. If I want to put in reporting interval, RI equals 3600. So remember, that's in seconds, right? Semicolon. So there's those things I just going to keep adding and putting in and adjusting as I need to and adjusting as needed. Right? So that's how you're going to create those DMARC records and you create your DMARC policy. And those are the changes that you're going to be making to your policies and to your records. All right, so let's go back here to the presentation. Just to wrap up, and then I will go back to the questions that are posed in the window. So now at this point, now we showed you how to do it. So you should be able to now go back and create your records for your domains, right? So SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. Remember, follow your, if you have third-party vendors, look up what they require for SPF and DKIM. For DMARC, that's what you control and that's what you're defining. If you have any questions at any point, either email us or go ahead and post those questions on the community forum. right? You're more than welcome to send us an email and tell us, hey, this is what I'm about to put in. Is that okay? Is something wrong? Does this look correct? And once you implement it, you can even come back to us and say, hey, can you check to make sure that it's in place? Could you actually see the record? We'll take a look and we'll look it up as well. So other thing, remember, so you're going to get an email about tomorrow's wet sessions and Thursday sessions. You do not need to attend those sessions unless you're interested in how to set it up in Bind and how to set up on a cloud DNS provider. Because otherwise the first half is going to be, again, it's just going to be repetitive. The first half is going to be what we already talked about. And then the last half is where we're going to talk about how to set up using Linux, and then also how to set up in cloud DNS on the 1st. And then next week on the 4th is going to be ongoing management. So talk about the reports and the report analysis. Just like last week, I told you, October 9th is the BIMI webinar. Please feel free to join us. At the end of the week, we'll send you an email with the registration links to join. We'll also, if you're following us on social media, we've already tweeted out and put on LinkedIn everything in terms of the registration. So feel free to start registering if you're following along there. All right, so I know we're about 4 minutes over, and I know there's quite a few questions. So if you can stay with us, please do so. If you can't, don't worry about it. I mean, we've gone through the hour, so you're going to get your credit for this session. I'm going to still be recording this, so you can always come back later and listen to the recording to hear any questions that you may have missed or you may be interested in. All right, but otherwise, thank you, and I hope to see you next week. So let's go through the questions. So first question is, if you own multiple domains but not typical hierarchy, like an example you gave, so m.city.org, but more like city.org and county.org, do you still need to use the SP tag? No, in those situations, well, if you're starting off, then yes, I would still recommend use SP equals reject, just to make sure that m.city.org and m.county.org aren't being used. Right, so I would still say use the SP tag, SP, but set SP equals to reject in those types of situations. Can a third party change their selector $1._domain key to like GCA $1._domain key, for example, so they can differentiate the selectors? No, so typically, so like for Microsoft, it will always be selector 1 and selector 2. They're not going to change it unless they, I mean, they'll have to tell you, obviously, if they do it. Some third parties, they give you the option to choose what your selector is. If they give you that option to choose your selector, I recommend changing it. You know, like Google G Suites, they use Google by default. So it's google._domain key. I recommend changing it. Don't use Google, use something else. So that way people don't know that you're not using Google. I mean, granted, they can get it from your MX records, but still, at least for the DKIM key, they don't know that that DKIM one, that particular DKIM record is used for the Google, used by Google. Let's see here. Sorry, my arrow key's not working very well. So we have an exchange online sending some outgoing mail to third-party spam filter while other email goes directly out, bypassing the third-party spam filter. How do we configure DKIM, seeing as we have 2 different sending paths? So what you would do, so it depends on the spam filter. If that spam filter had DKIM capabilities, then yeah, use the DKIM capabilities on that system. Some spam filters, third-party spam filters, don't have that DKIM capability. So that's why you're going to use the Exchange Online. So use Office 365 to do that and set up the DKIM there. But if that third-party filter does have the capability of doing signing, then you use that. So you will do it on both. So implement it on both just as a safeguard. Is it best practice to use RSA instead of an elliptical curve or compatibility with older mail servers? Now, there's no really best practice in terms of the what you should use for DKIM. Because there are some third-party vendors that will use SHA, they'll use SHA. So just use whatever is defined or whatever is created by that system. Just stick with that. I mean, if they give you an option, then use whichever one is going to be the most secure. That's really just the best practice is. But if they don't give you that option, then just you're stuck with whatever is given to you. but you're not going to be able to use your own algorithm, unfortunately. Like with Exchange, I mean, like the DKIM signing, it did give you the option to select your own key. So if you have the keys and you're generating your own keys, you can do that. Just make sure it's in a secure location. Some of the cloud gateways will actually let you use your key instead of having to generate the key on their own. You can select your own key, but just be wary of that. But as long as the DKIM signing capability is there, then you may have the option to choose your own keys instead of using that for your own generating the keys. So remember, it's the server that's doing the signing, right? So in this case, if the DKIM exchange is on the exchange server, that's the server that's doing the signing. Okay, so the signing is done wherever the key is located. So make sure that DKIM signing capability is present. So for creating SPF, DKIM, and DMARC records, we need to have 3 separate DNS TXT records. Yes. So SPF, you can have 1 record for that TXT. DKIM, you can have multiple records, right? DKIM could be multiple records, either TXT or CNAME, depending on what you're using. And DMARC, only 1 TXT record. That's the rule. So if we have Exchange hybrid with Exchange online, but our DNS record is in our internet provider, do I need to do the Exchange DKIM signer on my Exchange hybrid server? Yes, you do. So you're still going to use the Exchange DKIM signer, but then when it comes to publishing the public key, right? The public key is what you're putting on your internet provider, the DNS. If your internet provider is where your DNS is being hosted, that's where you're going to publish the public key portion, right? Private key stays with you, right? Remember, don't publish that. It's just the public key portion that's going to be put out on the public facing DNS. So this question about SPF alignment for DMARC decisions, please email me separately on that, and we can have, because that's a whole separate topic to discuss. Will the slides online have the hands-on demo? No, but this session has been recorded. The recording will be made available to you. Also, if you do go to our YouTube channel, we have a separate thing there for just Office 365. So if you just want to watch that portion, that's available on our YouTube channel. So that the slide deck won't have it, but the recording will be put up. We'll hopefully have the recording up. I'm hoping by Friday, but it could potentially be up on Monday next week. Up by Monday next week. So there's additional info on relaxed strict modes for DKIM SPF alignment. Please send an email me directly, and we can talk about that. So if I have an Office 365 signing, but hybrid centralized routing with third-party anti-spam, should I remove the Office 365 default DKIM signing and key only the one from my third anti-spam SMTP server? My recommendation is really to do both, because like someone said before, because some of these third-party mail systems tend to be awkward. Like they'll use one to send the mail, but then they'll use another system to send the calendar invite out. So it causes some issues. My recommendation is consider doing it on both. We don't have a hybrid O365 CES environment, YouTube, sorry. We just don't have access to CES. So unfortunately we don't have that set up on our end. But I mean, if you do have questions about the hybrid O365 CS environment and you would like some help and some guidance, feel free to reach out to us and we'll do our best to help you out and get you moving and get you going with that. So there's a question about having third-party certs. Yeah, so when it comes to DKIM, there is no those third-party certs or anything like that. That's why in most cases, third-party vendors want to handle the DKIM keys on their own, so that the way they're responsible for it. So they'll do the key rotations and things like that. But there's there's nothing that you need to go out and get a certificate from, like Entrust or DigiSign or VeriSign or anyone like that. You don't need to do anything like that. All right, so we are 13 minutes over. I don't see any additional questions, but again, if you do have any questions that you thought of, or if I may have missed your questions, because there was a ton of questions in there, so I apologize if I missed any of those. But if I missed it, please, again, feel free to send an email directly to us, and we'll get back to you with an answer as soon as we can. So thank you for joining. So again, reminder, if you get that email for tomorrow's and Thursday's session, you are not required to do that. You get the credit for today's session. You don't need to attend the other two unless you're really interested in learning how to set up SPF, DKIM, and DMARC on a bind system or on a cloud DNS. So you're welcome to join if you choose to. Otherwise, I'll see you next week for the reports and analysis. Thank you, and I hope to see you next week.